With the coming of sound, one Hollywood studio stood apart from the rest. Universal Pictures made horror films, and these horror films left an imprint on cinema history forever. There are many filmmakers, writers, and actors to celebrate from this era, but I think one man stands out. Universal's golden age of horror could not have happened without director James Whale. His film, Frankenstein, stands as the paramount feature of this horror movement, likely the most iconic monster of them all. Yet, Frankenstein wasn't the first horror film from Universal. Todd Browning's landmark horror film, Dracula, preceded it by 10 months. Also, there was a Spanish-language version of Dracula, and before that, a 1930 horror film called The Cat Creeps, from which only a few fragments survive. Not to mention several worthy and epic silent horror pictures. But James Whale's Frankenstein rose to the top, not just because of its iconic monster and Boris Karloff's brilliant lead performance, but also because director James Whale imbued the film with an immense sense of pathos and drama. Frankenstein was so successful that James Whale has become known as a master of horror, even though only 4 out of the 20 films he directed belong in the horror genre. Whale started his career in the theater. In 1928 and 1929, he directed Journey's End. The World War I play starred actor Colin Clive, and was written by R.C. Sheriff. It was a monumental hit, one that caught the eye of Howard Hughes. Hughes had shot a silent World War I aviation epic called Hell's Angels, but the production had dragged on due to Hughes' perfectionism, and with the release of The Jazz Singer, sound was the new rage. Hughes decided to reshoot large parts of Hell's Angels with sound. He chose an uncredited James Whale to direct the new sequences.
What are you thinking of?
If you must know, I was thinking of Monty.
Hell's Angels still took forever to put together. While that film was in post-production, James Whale found the time to film an adaptation of Journey's End in the UK, keeping Colin Clive in the lead. It was released in 1930, shortly before the bigger-budget Hell's Angels. The 1-2 punch of Journey's End and Hell's Angels piqued the interest of Universal Pictures. Whale soon found himself under contract. His first film for the company was the World War I-era romantic drama Waterloo Bridge. Even though it's not a horror film, Waterloo Bridge helped shape the path for James Whale as a director, career-wise, and more importantly, as an artist. The story concerns a self-loathing prostitute who is courted by a soldier from a rich family. She tries to resist him, to reject him, as she feels he deserves someone better than her. Yet, as she finally deems herself worthy of love and accepts his proposal, she is killed in an air raid on Waterloo Bridge. James Whale got a lot out of his female actors. The film featured a young Bette Davis in a supporting part, but it is Mae Clark's lead that truly shines. Clark was most famous for having James Cagney smash a grapefruit in her face in Public Enemy, but here, in Waterloo Bridge, she delivers a tender, wounded, and sad performance. This was pre-code Hollywood, where taboo subjects were eagerly discussed without much fear of the censors. A prostitute was the ultimate outsider, and though she is killed in the end, typical moralism for the cinema of that era, James Whale still treats the character with dignity and respect. She is an outsider, but Whale makes it clear, in both how actors are directed and in how the film is shot, that poor Mae Clark deserved better. It is sympathy for the outsider. Whale brought Waterloo Bridge in under budget. Impressed, Universal offered him the pick of any story they owned the rights to. Whale, fearing being typecast as a director of World War I pictures, chose Frankenstein. The book was in the public domain, but Universal owned the rights to the theatrical play based on Mary Shelley's novel. Whale wasn't the first person who had tried to get a sound film version of the Frankenstein story up and running. Director Robert Florey, who'd had a hit with the first Marx Brothers film The Coconuts, had filmed a 20-minute test reel with Bela Lugosi as the monster, using the sets from Dracula as a backdrop. All that survives from that version is this poster. Lugosi didn't want to do a non-speaking part, and the project was soon abandoned. Robert Florey, however, would later get to do big-budget horror, with the memorable The Beast with 5 Fingers. James Whale, however, managed to get his version of Frankenstein up and running. For his hero, he chose to reunite with Colin Clive. For the heroine, he picked Mae Clarke. And for the monster, he chose the unknown bit actor Boris Karloff, who'd previously been limited to mostly smaller, menacing supporting roles. The mix of cast, crew, director, and subject matter turned out to be perfect cinematic alchemy. The film is stylish, beautifully designed, well told, and with expressionist flourishes taken from German silent cinema that would later be adopted by many subsequent horror films. But the best part is the performances, particularly Karloff as the monster. The film captures Mary Shelley's heartbreaking creation, a thing to be pitied more than feared, although it is capable of violence too, make no mistake. Frankenstein focused on the creature as an outsider, sympathizing with it the same way Waterloo Bridge sympathized with Mae Clarke's prostitute. And that feeling of rejection and of being an outsider is key to the movie's success. Here might be a good time to mention that James Whale was gay. He was one of the few homosexual directors in Hollywood who didn't bother to hide it, instead standing defiant and proud against the limiting social mores of the 1930s. This has, of course, led to a lot of queer theory and analysis of his works, rightfully so. The monster becomes an allegory for homosexuality. Again, a perfectly legitimate take on the character, and of directorial intent. But others who knew James Whale, like his friend Curtis Harrington, has called this a wrong take. James Whale was an artist, one that was more than his sexuality. His being gay didn't steer his directorial choices in Frankenstein. It was just one aspect of a genius director, and that was it. I'm not entirely sure I buy that, as living as a gay man in the 1930s can't possibly have been an easy experience. Yet Whale didn't bother hiding it. Does this mean Frankenstein is a gay-coded film, or not? I'm going to side with it not being so, at least not explicitly, for two main reasons. Mary Shelley's origin novel told the story of a creature rejected from society. The film, despite varying a lot from the novel, keeps this theme throughout. It is Mary Shelley's theme, from her novel, and that is what guides the beating heart of the film. Secondly, I think this is a story of an outsider, a more general take on feeling different and rejected. That isn't necessarily exclusively a gay aspect of the story, though it certainly can be. Here, in Frankenstein, James Whale explores the outsider in the same way he did in Waterloo Bridge, with the same sympathy and care. Even the endings are similar, with both outsiders being destroyed, but they remain creatures to be pitied, and this is a recurring theme in the career of James Whale. No matter whether you believe there is gay coding or not in the directorial intent of Frankenstein, the film is brilliant. Building on the success of Todd Browning's Dracula, Whale's Frankenstein lifted Universal horror into the stratosphere. Previous American horror films weren't usually supernatural or fantastic in nature. They were stories of human killers rather than monsters. The first sound horror film produced by Universal, the aforementioned The Cat Creeps, was a more typical style haunted house hidden criminal film, just like the silent film The Cat and the Canary, from which it was remade. This is interesting because the killer in the old dark house trope was what Whale chose to tackle next. James Whale's second horror film is The Old Dark House. The film follows the tradition of creepy dark house thrillers like The Monster, One Exciting Night, The Cat and the Canary, The Terror, and many others like them. Yet James Whale was unwilling to simply follow in the footsteps of others. His film would not feature a hidden killer, or a big monkey, or any of the other cliches. He would instead reinvent the genre by way of parody. The story concerns a group of wayward travelers stranded at a house positively infested with strange characters, like sinister butlers and murderous pyromaniacs. Weirdness and a rather peculiar sense of humor ensues.
This certainly is a benighted household.
You're right, it is.
Look at those.
The cast is absolutely spectacular, with Boris Karloff, Raymond Massey, Melvin Douglas, Charles Lawton, Lillian Bond, Ernst Thesiger, and Gloria Stewart, a dream cast if there ever was one. In addition to the performances, Whale carries the virtually plotless affair through on style and atmosphere. The film is defiantly peculiar and oddball. It wasn't a big hit, and after the Hays Code took effect, all prints vanished. Thanks to the aforementioned Curtis Harrington, we can still see the old dark house today. He tracked down and rescued a print, and the film has had a critical reappraisal in more recent years. Still, it remains the least known Whale horror film. In my opinion, this is because the film is a study in eccentricity and oddity, rather than a delve into what James Whale did best, taking the outsider's point of view and making audiences truly feel it. For his third genre film, James Whale chose an adaptation of the H.G. Wells novel The Invisible Man, marrying that science fiction narrative with a black sense of humor.
Here we go gathering nuts in May, nuts in May, nuts in May. Here we go gathering nuts in May on a cold and frosty morning.
Lead character Claude Rains turns invisible and soon becomes mad and murderous. The Invisible Man is an outsider as well, but not so much one to be pitied. Rather, Rains, in a brilliant performance, channels the absurdity of the world and his rage against it. The film is really very funny, far more so than sad and scary. It was a smash hit and one of the most critically revered films of 1933. It also launched an ongoing franchise of Invisible Man films, both classic and modern, but they will in due time get their own episode. At this point in his career, James Whale's biggest hits were horror films, and just like he had been worried about being typecast as a World War I drama director, Whale was now beginning to worry about only getting horror assignments. He took several other jobs, but none of them managed to live up to the commercial success of Frankenstein and The Invisible Man, nor, one could argue, did these other films live up to the artistic success of his horror cinema. Perhaps his perspective as a filmmaker lent itself so well to the horror genre, which was itself something of an outsider genre in terms of respectability and acclaim. Yet, Whale conquered this aspect as well, giving his horror material an artistic flair and genuine heart. He, like all great horror directors before and since, took the genre seriously, infusing it with pathos, heart, and societal observation. In the end, Whale gave in to Universal's demands and made another horror film, one he took just as seriously as his non-horror cinema, and, as time goes by, this has resulted in perhaps his most celebrated film. I am, of course, talking about The Bride of Frankenstein. Bride of Frankenstein is arguably James Whale's magnum opus. It features the return of the monster and of its maker, and it introduces new and memorable characters like Ernst Thesinger's Dr. Pretorius and Elsa Lanchester's The Bride. Now, remember when I concluded that the first Frankenstein wasn't gay-coded? Well, the sequel seems to play far more on homosexual themes. There's a sense of camp, and then there's the theme of friendship being thwarted by people who just don't understand.
What are you doing? This is my friend. Friend?
However, the film doesn't overtly state that it is gay cinema, but hey, that's what the subtext is there for. The character of Dr. Pretorius certainly reflects a 1930s take on homosexuality.
Bullshit, my dear Baron, is the word for knowing too much.
Yet others, like Curtis Harrington, have expressly said that Whale's perspective was that of an outsider, and not necessarily a reflection of sexuality. No matter what you believe, gay subtext or simply outsider subtext, The Bride of Frankenstein is a really great horror film. However, it did face a lot of resistance from censors, including when Japan objected to the mocking of royalty with this miniature king. So, is the film gay-coded or not? Really, you can read into it that way, or you can choose not to. In my opinion, neither interpretation is wrong. James Whale invoked an amazing duality and psychological depth in his films, allowing viewers to see his works as multifaceted creations. But one thing remains absolutely certain. James Whale's cinema champions the outsiders, sympathizing with them. Following Bride of Frankenstein, Whale turned down the chance to direct Dracula's Daughter, the first sequel to Todd Browning's 1931 hit. Ironically, that film has achieved a certain amount of cult status for exploring overtly lesbian themes. Instead, Whale chose to make an adaptation of the stage musical Showboat. It was a massive and lavish production, and again, the film allowed for viewpoints from outsider characters, most memorably in the spectacular Old Man River musical number, featuring the astounding Paul Robeson.
But Old Man River, he just keeps rolling along.
After the Laemmle family lost control of Universal Pictures, James Whale's career waned. His war drama, The Road Back, a sequel to All Quiet on the Western Front, was, after pressure from Nazi Germany, savaged by Universal's new leadership. The film was cut against Whale's wishes, removing a lot of anti-war material. Despite acquiescing to Nazis, the film was still banned in Germany, Japan, and even in other nations trying to appease the bastards. Sadly, James Whale's original cut of The Road Back seems to be irretrievably lost. James Whale only directed a few more films before returning to the theater. Then his health declined. Whale died by suicide at age 67 in 1957. He'd been suffering illness and depression for some time. James Whale is an icon, as a horror director and as an advocate of the outsiders. Writer-director Bill Condon made Gods and Monsters, an interesting drama about Whale's last years. I recommend it as a double feature with The Bride of Frankenstein. It featured excellent performances by Ian McKellen as Whale and Brendan Fraser as Clayton Boone, a fictitious character invented specifically for the film. As a director, Whale left behind a legacy unsurpassed by most in the horror field. His 4 horror films are all classics, and they represent some of the most beloved motion pictures in the golden age of Universal horror. Because on their take on the outsider, casting the monster as a dark hero, offering them either sympathy or wit, or both, these films remain relevant to this day. As Universal Pictures seek to rebuild the golden age of monsters, a monster universe, they do it on the foundation established by James Whale, a great artist and a great outsider. My name is Wolfcraft. This is History of Horror. If you liked the episode, I'd sure appreciate it if you liked, shared, and subscribed. Also, if you want to check out some of my other works, I'm an author. My science fiction novel, God of Desolation, is currently available on Amazon, and my upcoming mystery novel, Richly Drawn, will be available on inkshares.com in late 2021. Thanks aplenty.